Our next speaker is Pieper, who was a middle and high school science teacher and currently helps run a farm with his wife Elena. And in Arroyo Seco, he has been a Sepia commissioner and has been active with water protectors in Taos, New Mexico. And he's going to talk about optimizing biodiversity on small farms. So, welcome, Chris.
I don't even know if I need it. Do I need it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's nice.
Yes. Tell me if is that okay?
Nice.
Okay. So, optimizing diversity on small farms. So years ago, after listening to way too much NPR and Amy Goodman, I was quite depressed. I didn't really have a positive outlook on the future. And when I started learning about regenerative farming, that totally changed. And so I wanted to share that with you today, that there is good news, in addition to the bad news. And I think the good news far outweighs the good news. The good news far outweighs the bad news. So, in ancient Persian, the word for garden was synonymous with paradise. And so, in my view, small, diverse farms in Oh, okay. Small, diverse farms in locally diverse communities is the vision of the future. That's the world I will live in. So when we look at how we've grown food for the last 50, 70 years, it's based on a relationship to nature that has destroyed nature. How we grow food has caused all of these problems. Pollution, there's a little feedback there.
Yeah.
Pollution of the oceans, basically all the water on the planet. It's led to desertification of estimated 40% of the land surface of the planet, massive loss of biodiversity, destruction of primary forests, climate change, poor human health and poverty, loss of topsoil, just to name a few. So this was an ad that appeared in Time magazine in 1947. So after World War II, a lot of the factories that were commissioned to make bombs became factories that made fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. It went from a war on each other to a war on nature. As we know, war is profitable. And so DDT was promoted as basically a panacea because we were at war with insects, we were at war with fungi, we were at war with weeds, and so the chemical industry stepped right in. And it's interesting to look at the incidence of a lot of the degenerative diseases that we suffer from today. And here's a graph illustrating, showing in the dotted line here, that's the use of DDT and other pesticides, a lot of those containing lead and arsenic. A lot of those pesticides are designed to attack the nervous systems of insects. Well, it's interesting to look at the incidence of polio, and a lot of the symptoms of polio match the symptoms of pesticide poisoning. But of course, instead of blaming the pesticides, The scapegoat was infectious diseases. Well, let's get to good news. So, regenerative agriculture can reverse all the problems that I listed before. And the United Nations came out a couple of years ago and said that regenerative agriculture is the best hope we have for reversing climate change and rehydrating the planet, as we'll talk about later. So I love this quote. This is from Alice in Wonderland. Imagination is the only weapon in the war against reality. And the Cheshire Cat. Can you see the Cheshire Cat? So, really, it's time for us to imagine living in a different world. Not a world that's based on warfare and separation and conflict, but a world that's based on cooperation. So let's take a look at healthy soil and how healthy soil is very much tied to biodiversity. So we'll look at soil health, and then we'll go into the practical ways that we can achieve that on our lands. So soil is by far the most biologically diverse ecosystem on the planet. There are over 1,000 species of invertebrates that can be found in a single cubic meter of healthy soil. A single shovelful of healthy soil has more biodiversity than the entire Amazon rainforest. 1 cubic centimeter can have up to 60 feet of fungal mycelium. That's the network that we're going to talk about in just a second. Or 195,000 miles per acre. Every species of plant has its own unique microbiome or rhizosphere, just like you have your own unique microbiome, your gut, intestinal flora. Every plant has its own unique microbiome that it actively feeds, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Close to 50% of the sugars from photosynthesis go to feed the microbiome in the soil. So plants are actively feeding the microbial community in the soil. Healthy soil is made up of roughly 66% air. Every 1% increase in soil carbon amounts to an additional 25,000 gallons of water storage per acre. So as a water protector, my focus really has been to try to educate people about how soil is our best way to capture and store water, not reservoirs. Plants and animals, microbes are in constant communication through chemical signaling, which we'll talk about in just a second. And plants function at their best when there are many kinds of microbes living around the roots. So, in all ecosystems on the planet, biodiversity is a key factor. Here's a coral reef. I took this picture last year. No, I'm joking, I wish I did. But coral reefs and tropical rainforests have a lot of similarities. They're both some of the most nutrient-poor environments on the planet. That's why the water is so clear. And all the biomass and all the nutrients in rainforests are tied up in the biology. And but what they are rich in is relationships. The most relationship-rich environments on the planet, except for soil. So here's a little diagram of the tall grass prairie. And you can see the diversity of plants. The tall grass prairie had over 400 different species of plants, 250 species of grasses alone. And if we were to look at this from a Darwinian perspective, we'd say all of these plants are competing with one another. And 10 years ago, most scientists still believe that. But now soil scientists are recognizing that plants cooperate. Nature is based on symbiosis and cooperation, not competition. And the more diversity, the more they cooperate, which is extraordinary. So the greater diversity of plants, the more cooperation you get. So here's an example. Here's two different kinds of plants. You've got an amaranth and a bean plant of some kind. And they're not only exchanging nutrients through their shared fungal network, but they're also exchanging microbes. They're exchanging genetic information. These plants are constantly in communication with one another, as is their microbial communities. And when it comes to trees, it was assumed for a very long time that trees in the forest are all competing against one another. And maybe some of you saw the TED Talk by Suzanne Simard. She's a forest ecologist in British Columbia, and she was the first to identify and to prove that actually trees are sharing nutrients through their shared fungal networks. And even trees of different species. So what they found is that conifers and deciduous trees, in this case, a Pieper birch and a Douglas fir, these trees will share nutrients at different times during the year. So during the wintertime, when the evergreen is still photosynthesizing, it will share sugars and nutrients with the Pieper birch. During the summer, it's the reverse. And so in a forest, trees are constantly signaling to one another what their needs are. And so trees that are struggling tend to get more nutrients from the trees surrounding them, and it's all through the fungal network. And now they're starting to recognize that actually the brain is maybe in the fungi. It's the fungi that's directing this whole orchestra. It's the fungi that recognizes which trees need nutrients and need support. So here's an experiment that was done in Germany, and it's ongoing. It's called the Biodiversity Experiment. And what they've looked at is the effect that diversity has on plant productivity. And sure enough, what they found is that as the number of species goes up, so does plant productivity. And what they found that's critical with the mix of different species is that there's 4 main functional groups of plants. There's legumes, like peas and vetch and alfalfa and so forth. Grasses, brassicas like broccoli, cabbage, that family, mustard. And then herbaceous plants, broadleaf plants, which is kind of all the other plants. And nature hates monocultures. So when plants are grown in monoculture like this, do they cooperate? No. They actually compete. So when you put plants of the same species together, they do not cooperate. It would be, an analogy would be like if there was a town that only had bakers. Would those bakers cooperate with one another? No, they would be competing against one another. And would it be a healthy community? No, it wouldn't be. But when you have a diversity of different jobs and relationships and skills, that encourages cooperation, and that is how nature does it. So here's an interesting study that I came upon last week. And it's been assumed for a long time that the reason why our foods are getting more and more deficient in minerals is because there are less and less minerals in the soil. One would assume that would be the case. That if you're getting 76% less copper in your vegetables, and 30% less iron, and 50% less calcium. That's because we've mined the soils of those minerals. Well, now what they're finding is the reason why we're getting this loss in nutrient density in our foods is not because of the depletion of minerals in the soils as much as the destruction of the biology in the soils. When you have a healthy, robust, diverse soil, those minerals become more available. In fact, they're only available when you have a healthy ecology. So, with our farm, we used to think that add compost. How many of you in here think the best way to have a good garden is just keep adding compost? That's what we thought. Just keep adding compost. And our garden kept declining. Well, we gotta add more compost. We're not adding enough compost, so we just kept adding and adding and adding. And then eventually, I came upon a talk by a woman named Christine Jones from Australia. And she said what drives healthy soil more than anything is photosynthesis. And so plants will build healthy soil 5 to 30 times faster than compost will, or decayed organic matter. So I used to think, well, okay, I would plant a cover crop and then immediately till it in to provide food for the soil, because the soil needs the decomposing plant matter. Well, that is not the case. So the way that plants feed their microbes is through what are called root exudates. If you look this up, you'll find lots of scientific literature on it. It's a really fascinating study. It's only less than 10 years old that scientists have discovered this. And so root exudates are basically sugars that the plant creates specific for different kinds of microorganisms in the soil. So plants are actively feeding their microbial communities with these sugars. This is after lunch, so I know everybody's tired. Are you guys staying awake?
Yeah.
Need to tell a joke? Okay. Quorum sensing and signaling. So, when we look at like that grass out there, or we go into a forest, it's quiet. We don't know how incredibly active, it's like a very active internet. Plants and insects, microbes, fungi and plants, they're all actively communicating through chemical signals. And the way that the soil biology works, what they found is that there's something called quorum sensing. So if you have an organization that requires a certain number of people or a quorum to take a vote and have a meeting, you can't have the meeting unless you have enough people, right? Or if you have a business and not all the employees are there, you can't run a business. And so the way that microbes know who's present and in what numbers is through these chemical signals. And so microbes can turn on and off genes based on who's there. Insect and plant communication, we could talk for the rest of the afternoon about this, or any of these topics. But, of course, in this case, this plant is sending out some kind of chemical signal to attract the pollinators, in this case, a honeybee. But plants also send out chemical signals to insects, like if they're being attacked, they will send out chemical signals to attract the predator of that insect. Or if plants are sick, they will send out signals to say, come eat me because I'm sick. So like if a plant all of a sudden is full of aphids, that may be because that plant knows that it's in distress and it needs to be eaten. And so plants will actually reach out and say, the table's set, come with me. So this woman is named Lynn Margulies. How many have heard of Lynn Margulies? Yeah, a couple people have heard of Lynn Margulies. So Lynn Margulies, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but she was a scientist. She was married to Carl Sagan, Carl Sagan's first wife. And Lynn was a woman, and of course, and she was a scientist, and at the time, science was totally dominated by men. And she was the first scientist to come out and say, look, nature is not based on survival of the fittest. Nature is not based on competition. Nature is based on symbiosis. And her ideas and her theories were totally rejected at first. But now, there is an ecologist on the planet that doesn't know about Lynn's theories. And they are generally accepted to be the case. So let's move on. So strategies for diversifying our gardens and building healthy soil. Create structural diversity in microclimates. Follow the 5 healthy soil principles. Intercrop with flowers and functional plant groups. Use diverse cover crops. Compost in greenhouse and harvest extension. So let's take a look at each one of these. So here's an example of structural diversity. You have dead trees, standing dead trees. You have logs. You have a lot of complexity, structural complexity in this old-growth forest. A lot of habitat, which encourages diversity, biological diversity. And we can recreate that on our farms. So my daughter's boyfriend put these slides together. So here we start with a house. So just a house in itself creates a number of microclimates. The south-facing portion of the house is warmer. The north-facing portion is cooler. So right there you have 2 microclimates. Then, for those of you from southern Colorado and New Mexico, we know about irrigation ditches. That creates a small little riparian habitat. Then we start to irrigate. Then we have some chickens. And then fruit trees provide canopy and shade. There's a little bird there. Then the garden, the compost pile, a greenhouse, a rock wall, and a fence. Fences can be fantastic for helping create more diversity. We've created some vertical structures, and so we've tried to take advantage of every microclimate that we've created on the farm. How many of you are familiar with the 4 or 5 healthy soil principles? A few of us here. So this was National Resource and Conservation Service has actually been fantastic. It's a government organization that is really doing a lot of good. And believe it or not, they've been one of the primary drivers of regenerative agriculture, the NRCS. There's a guy named Ray Archuleta. They call him the soil guy. He actually grew up in New Mexico, and he's been really at the forefront of educating farmers about no-till practices in regenerative agriculture. So the 4 principles are, first, minimize disturbance. Because what happens every time we till the soil? We're destroying all that beneficial structure in the soil. We're forcing the soil to start all over again. It's like going into a city and taking down all the buildings. And then every year the city has to rebuild itself. So try to minimize disturbance. Maximize continuous living roots in the soil. Because remember, what feeds the soil? It's plants. It's plants feed the soil. Maximize biodiversity. through crop rotation, through diverse cover crops, through intercropping, and we'll discuss that in a moment. And then maximize soil cover. So if you can't get around to, let's say, planting a cover crop in the fall and getting something growing in your beds, cover your beds in the fall with leaves, with mulch, just to keep them moist. Having that cover can make a big difference. So here's an example of a garden that has been thoroughly intercropped. You can see the nasturtium in here, there are marigolds, there's calendula, there's statice, there's borage, there's many different kinds of flowers. And those flowers do a great job of attracting pollinators and all the insects that depend on the nectar, because these plants are giving out food. And so you can really dramatically increase the biodiversity in your garden by having flowers. One thing that we're going to do this summer is intercrop plant nasturtium with our cabbages and our broccoli, because nasturtium. Everybody's jealous of John's greenhouse. He's got a phenomenal greenhouse, and Melinda's greenhouse is phenomenal. We just built this greenhouse, and it really, because essentially what you're doing is you're creating an environment that is like southern New Mexico or northern Mexico. So you can extend your harvest season by months, on the order of months. And you can grow all winter. So I took this picture yesterday. You can see the snow on the side there. And this is a cover crop mix, brassicas and grasses and legumes. So we're just trying to build the soil. And then we've got greens in the greenhouse. So I wanted to end with just a super positive message about what's happening on the planet. And an effective way to do that is to tell stories. This is a picture from Slovakia, where there was a major dam proposed for an entire watershed. The villagers all got together and they came up with their own plan. They said, rather than put in a dam and retain all this water and destroy all this habitat, let's create all these water retention features in the watershed. Let's see if we can't capture the moisture that we do get and increase the amount of water coming out of our watershed and extend the irrigation season. So they employed 4,000 villagers from surrounding communities, and they put in 40,000 water retention features like this. And after about 5 years, they achieved exactly what they were hoping for. The watershed is retaining more water, they've extended their irrigation season, and they've actually even affected local climate. Some of you probably have read Braiding Sweetgrass. Well, there's a passage in there called All Flourishing is Mutual. And it's about what pecan trees do. And I'll just read it for you here. If one pecan tree fruits, they all fruit. There are no soloists. Not one tree in a grove, but the whole grove. Not one grove in the forest, but every grove. All across the country and all across the state, the trees act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. Exactly how they do this, we don't know. But what we see is the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. We can starve together or feast together. All flourishing is mutual. And so that's the last slide. Okay. Any questions? Comments? Oh. And I have some brochures on a cover cropping project that my daughter's involved with, and they're here at the table, and they describe the benefit of using diverse cover crops. And if you contact us, you might be able to get some free cover crop seed. So I'm going to put these here. Thank you. Yes?
So how many acres are you growing, like, vegetables?
Very small. So we're maybe a little less than a quarter acre, probably about a quarter acre.
But if you include the orchard and the berries and we have greenhouses in number of places, maybe it's
But she
closer
asked
to an
about
acre.
that. She asked about vegetables.
Oh.
So probably a little less than a quarter acre.
And so to create diversity, are you planting rows of all the same thing? Are you alternating plants? How do you manage that?
That's a good question. So in the past, we planted rows of all the same thing. And this summer, we're going to be actively intercropping, especially flowers. So flowers, from the studies that have been done, if you intercrop flowers, you can increase the overall productivity of your vegetables. And at the same time, they become more resilient to pests and soil diseases.
But we've also been doing more intercropping. Like we had a block that was chard and lettuce and beets and radish. They were just kind of like all planted together, and that soil is really fertile. And some areas, we're just trying to plant more mixes of things. So lettuce mixes and Asian green mixes and things where you're getting a lot more species.
And the other thing, if you look up companion planting, like for example, tomatoes really like to be planted with basil and borage and alyssum. And then they don't like to be planted next to potatoes, for example. They don't like to be planted next to plants that are in their same family.
Another nightshade.
No, nightshade, yeah, exactly. So, and there was a study done in Australia where they can't explain what's going on, but they took plexiglass and they separated out tomato plants from the adjacent bed, so there was no way that the plants could communicate through chemical signaling or through the roots, and somehow the tomatoes knew when they were next to plants that are companion to the tomatoes. Like when they put tomatoes next to basil, they both did better. And they don't know how the plants know the presence of the other plant, but somehow they do.
Huh.
So there's a lot we still need to know about plants and plant communication. So, anything else? Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about the grasses.
Yes.
What kind of grasses do you find best by you, and where would you get the seeds from?
So like oats can be really beneficial. I mean, definitely we like to plant annual grasses because if you plant perennials, then it becomes a problem in the garden. You know, if you're focusing on areas where you want to build the soil, oats are really good because they come up quickly, and you can go to any feed store and just get whole oats, and they'll sprout and they'll work well. And because oats come up quickly, they can provide shade for the other seeds that are intercropped with those oats. Wheat, barley also do really well, but oats have been definitely a favorite for us. Yeah. And rye.
Do you let them go to seed and then self-seed again?
No. Yeah, you want to take out the plants. So what we do is we'll cut the plants out right when they're flowering, and then feed them to the goats. And then we'll lightly till in, the first 2 inches or so, the residue, and then we'll plant directly into that. Yeah.
So this is all very fascinating. It seems plants might be telepathic.
Yeah.
And that's another subject. But I wanted to go back to the cooperation model that you illustrated. And I immediately thought about invasive species. And I'm not sure what I'm asking, except can you speak to that?
Yes, well, yeah, so I think that's a prime, let's look at Hawaii,
Okay.
for example. So there's something called functional diversity. So Hawaii is very diverse, but it's not an example of functional diversity because you've got a lot of plants that didn't evolve together, that shouldn't even be together. And so then they end up competing with one another. So like you've got, on Kauai, you've got blackberry, which has become an incredibly invasive, choking plant. And of course, blackberry didn't evolve on Kauai. So you can have invasive plants destroy biodiversity. So it's, and when you have really well-structured soil, typically you won't have the invasive plants like bindweed. We've had real problems with bindweed on our farm, but less so once we stopped tilling. So it's really helped.
So that brings me to the second part, which is, would you say that the practices you're proposing could preemptively mitigate invasive species events?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah, like our neighbor plowed their field and didn't seed. They're directly to the west of us, and all these weeds came up. But are the weeds the problem, or is the problem the tillage? And so the weeds are just coming in there to do their job, to help restore the soil structure, help restore the soil. And so, in conventional agriculture, weeds are treated as enemies, but they're indicators. And so if we can restore healthy soil and functional biodiversity, we shouldn't have a problem with invasive plants. Yep, Linda?
The new kind of soil microbiology science is also very strongly pointing out that soil that is high in bacterial counts and certain types of microbiology that's related to bacteria is a prime place for weeds to grow. That's like a weed's favorite soil condition. So the type of tillage like that the neighbor did, it turned that whole field into the whole soil has this bacterial response to the tillage, and so then that becomes like the perfect place for all those weeds to grow on top of it. So using different kinds of tillage methods and using them more wisely and so on and so forth also.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's exactly right. So you end up you want fungal dominant soils instead of bacteria dominant soils. And you can achieve that by leaving it alone and planting cover crops and managing it in the way that we discussed. Yeah?
Did you introduce mycelium or fungus?
No, we haven't. But I know it's quite a business. Yeah, so I've heard that it's really not necessary. But you can do inoculants, so yeah.
I had the chance speaking to all of those, affected microorganisms and seeing microbiology and so on and so forth. I had the opportunity to attend a workshop that a scientist from NMSU presented at a conference. And actually the task of her workshop was to test various products like that and find out what was actually in them. And from the results of her testing, I would not waste my money on those products. None of them had what they said they had in them. None of them had the high level of counts that they were promised, and so on and so forth. And I think there are more effective ways. The root exudates from the plants and the soil are going to create those things. You just need to foster them. I think I didn't catch all of Chris's talk. I'm sorry, but by keeping the soil covered up and using those 4 basic principles, you're allowing the soil to do that, and you have to spend some physical effort and labor, but you're not buying the product from somebody. And then it's like your native affected microorganisms that are growing, and they're the healthiest ones to have in your ecosystem.
Yes.
Are you saying fungal inoculants or the microbiome?
I think she specifically tested the what were considered effective microorganisms, which I don't know specifically if they would be fungal or microbial, to be honest.
Yeah, I know that I heard one talk where they said that compost tea can be actually very helpful, but if you take a pound of compost, let's say, and you put it in a plastic bucket, and then you feed it with molasses and maybe some powdered milk, and you aerate it for 24 hours, then you're going to select for only certain species. But what you want is you want the diversity. So what this soil scientist was saying is the best thing to do is to take a pound of compost, and you could get that from a healthy aspen forest, you could get it from a healthy part of your garden, and then just mix it. And then just pour it on direct. Because then you're getting the full diversity. You know, and there's now studies coming out that are questioning the effectiveness of probiotics. Because we have only about 10% of the microbial diversity that our ancestors did, you know, a couple hundred years ago. And, but still, that's, you know, we have up to 40,000 different species, bacteria and fungi too. And by loading your system with only 10 or 12 or maybe 15 species of bacteria, you're not necessarily encouraging maximum and really healthy diversity. So that was an Israeli study, if you can look it up. So, but it's billions and billions of dollars in revenue from probiotics. So
What you're saying
Yeah.
about making a compost tea is just mixing your compost with water,
Yeah.
not feeding it molasses or milk, because some of those bacteria don't eat that stuff.
yeah, a lot of the organisms in there don't. Yeah, so you just want to just mix it and pour it on quickly.
And
Yeah.
were you just saying probiotics are like only 14 or 15? What was the 15 number that you just?
Oh, I just made that up.
But okay, but are you saying that like the probiotics that we as consumers are embracing
Yes.
are just a very limited number of bacteria?
Yes,
and
yeah.
may or may not benefit our gut.
Right. Yeah, there was an Israeli study that
It's
was
a
done.
billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, so there are plenty of studies probably saying just the exact opposite of what I just did. Yes?
Speaking of billion-dollar industries, are you easily able to show that chart at the top of your slideshow about the DDT usage?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Fire.
Sorry to make you scroll.
No,
down
no,
the
no,
slides. So, if you'll indulge in a little bit of
Yeah.
irreverent humor, I thought the official story was that the vaccine cured polio.
Well, that is the official story, but what's interesting about that is that while the United States was vaccinated, I think 140 million people were vaccinated, Europe was not. And yet, polio declined in Europe at the same rate it did here. So, you know, it's the same kind of story with the sugar industry. In the 60s, government scientists started recognizing that, wow, I think sugar consumption is killing us. And it's causing diabetes, it's causing heart disease, it's contributing to cancer. And the sugar industry has a huge lobby, bigger than the oil industry. And so they hired a Harvard scientist who said, oh, no, it's not sugar, it's saturated fat. That's what's killing us. And so then there was a huge industry that developed around no fat. And so even to this day, there are doctors that still tell their patients to avoid saturated fat. And they don't say anything about sugar. So, anyhow. Yeah, there's quite a bit. You know, it's hard to find these studies, but, you know, clearly we are being exposed to so many hormone disruptors. I mean, look at the number of Americans that are insulin resistant today. Well, insulin is a hormone. And plastics, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, a lot of these chemicals that we're exposed to fire retardants are affecting the health of our immune systems, and our human health and the health of the land are so intimately tied. There's a guy named Zach Bush. Does anybody listen to Zach Bush? Yeah, he's really good. And he was, I think, one of the first doctors to make the connection between human health and healthy soil. And so he's really good to listen to. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Great questions. Yeah.
Here I have one.
Questions are the best part, by the way.
Okay, the co-op has been given the opportunity to farm 1 acre of land. It was formerly, several years ago, an alfalfa field. Most of the alfalfa is not there anymore. And the owner of the land has offered to disc it about that deep. And in listening to what you're saying, oh, that's a bad idea. But then here's this field full of hard, lumpy dirt.
Yeah.
What would you do?
Well, I'd probably disc it.
Oh, okay, and then what?
Yeah, because disc it, but you just disc it that one time. And then you come in with cover crops, and you start to rebuild that soil. But if you have a field that has perennial grasses, alfalfa, deep-rooted alfalfa, probably going to have to disc it. I mean, I think that somebody who's more capable of answering that would be Melinda. So Melinda Bateman, she's sitting right behind you. So, yeah, she might say this. And their approach is no-till, but the way they achieve no-till is they use a shitload of compost. And so they'll harvest, and then they will add compost, and then plant directly into that compost. And so they just continuously add compost, and it's working for them. It's working for them. We're using a little bit of compost, but we're focusing mainly on the use of cover crops to achieve that no-till. Because you can't just go no-till cold turkey like we've tried in the past. It didn't work at all for us. You've got to build up to it.
Well, once you plant the cover crop, then you have to till that in.
Not necessarily. If you plant just annuals, you can just lightly skim it, with a hoe. Or you can pull it out. I mean, sometimes we'll just cut it at the base. We'll feed that to the goats. And the chickens will eat it too. And then we'll lightly till. We'll try and just till the first top 2 inches. Or we'll use a hoe just to break up those roots, just so they don't come back. And then you can plant directly into that. That's what we found. It works.
So I know you have quite a few animals on your farm, and I'm curious how you utilize them. Are you just using their manure, or are you using them to go weed or dig up things?
Well, we feed them the cover crop, right? And then we use their manure. And so I think it's like wealth. If wealth is distributed, it has the maximum benefit. If you distribute that manure and you distribute it effectively, then it has the greatest benefit. And so what we do is, and I didn't discuss this, but we have a wood chip garden.
Yeah, and in the pathways, we do manure and wood chips, and then that all these worms are in there. If you dig it up a little bit, you can see tons of worms underneath the wood chips. So we're encouraging very healthy soil ecology underneath the pathways, and then biodiversity in the beds, and it seems to work really well. Yeah. And the animals are also great for eating all the weeds. So, I mean, we do deal with weeds. So those go to the animals, and then their manure comes back in the garden, and it's a perfect little cycle.
The goats eat bindweed.
Yeah.
They eat thistle.
Mm-hmm.
And they eat your fruit trees.
Yeah, so keep them out of your orchard.
Yes?
Yeah, I just want to say to the method of wood chips and manure.
Yeah.
Works great, but what I found what supercharges it even more is just add a little bit of the local soil to it. I find that adds more minerals
Oh, yeah.
to the mix, and that's yeah.
So
Makes you embarrassed.
add some soil
Just a
to it?
little bit of soil, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
When I like if I make a row of trees, for instance,
yeah,
and I put the wood chips and the manure down, I make like a drenchment of the plant my trees,
yeah.
and then I just put in mix in some shovelfuls of the surrounding dirt, stir it in.
Yeah.
Works great. Because
Yeah,
I have
works.
like here, basically, like what you see out here, that's kind of what I have. It's low,
Oh, yeah.
and it's perfect. Yeah, it works great.
Yeah. Well, the wood chip, if you really want to look into that, there's a lot of information on the internet about it. But having wood chips and manure is really important. And in our climate, it won't decompose and become real rich soil unless you keep it moist. Because if you let it dry out, it will not decompose. So, yes?
We have a particular kind of grass on our acreage, and the roots are really, really tight and grown together, and it's not a healthy grass. What could I plant to take that out? It's called vetch or something, I don't know what it's called.
Melinda, what do you think?
I don't think there's any, well, dry might compete with it, but
What is it?
dry.
So you can plant another grass,
Okay.
and winter rye will outcompete it.
But
Yeah. But grass is difficult. I mean,
yeah, you really,
it's tough
how
to get
big
it out.
Really nasty grass.
Yeah.
how big an area is it?
Yeah. Is it wiregrass?
I don't know,
I know what you're talking about, but I can't, the name's on the tip of my tongue. It's not, how big an area is it?
it's quite large.
Yeah, quite a large area.
Yeah.
I mean, another possibility would be to use some of those, sheet composting or sheet mulching methods through the permaculture world, where you put down cardboard and you put down like a really thick layer and you leave it there for a couple of years.
Yeah, you can do that, and then put wood chips and manure over top.
Yeah, which is manure over top. And then what you can do after a couple of years is you can actually, I don't know what you want to plant in it, but you can then go back and start digging, like creating holes in the whole system and planting. You'll probably still have a little bit of grass, but you'll be able to grow and be able to work with it.
Okay.
I think it's called quack grass.
What's it
Oh,
called?
Yeah, I think it's called quack grass.
It's
really
really.
invasive, nodulated grass.
Or you can just dig it out and just take out a clump and just shake it. And it's a lot of work. I'm sorry. Okay.
Any other questions?